from Berlin. Thank you, Mohammed, for the confirmation, and Abdurrazak. Thank you. So if the sound is good and you can all see the slides, then we can go ahead and start with today's today's webinar on 10 tips to improve your proposal budget.
All right. So can I just introduce myself? I'm Juliet, the digital marketer, and today's speaker is Hande, one of our wonderful consultants. Before I hand over, I would love to do a quick overview. Today we'll be chatting, as Hande just said, about 10 tips to improve your proposal budget. And in this webinar, we will share some tips on surrounding the budget being the centerpiece of a successful proposal. Welcome to everyone. Please feel free to drop a line in the comments to introduce yourselves, your organizations, and let us know where you are logging in from. Just a quick note, the slides and recording will be shared with you after the webinar via email. If you do not receive them, please feel free to email us at hello@mzninternational.com. We want to give you plenty of time for questions at the end, especially given the high turnout. I imagine there'll be lots to discuss. So please leave any questions you have in the webinar Q&A function and not in the chat. All right, over to you, Hande. Hande? Thank you, everyone. I think we have lost Hande. Hi, Albert Don from the Netherlands. Welcome. And Pascal from the Netherlands. And Sona from Liberia. Welcome. Muaza from Johannesburg. I'm also from South Africa. I'm in Cape Town. Kenya, Nigeria. Welcome to everyone. London, Lindsay from London. Oh, I think we have Hande back. Can I hand over to you now?
Where did you miss? Where did you lose me?
I just took over and introduced the webinar and you, and now it's ready to start.
Okay, thank you very much, Jules. MZ10 is an organization that works with NGOs to help them be better funded and operate better and deploy smarter strategies. And as a social enterprise, most of our services are already subsidized, and something to keep an eye out for is our in-person trainings are back. So we look forward to meeting you in person in class environments as well. In today's webinar, while we will be talking about the tips and tricks of preparing a budget for proposals, we will try to keep it as short and concise as possible so that we can also address any questions you might have on the topics. In summary, there will be 3 main talking points, one of which is preparing budgets from start to finish. And then we'll be talking a little bit about donor requirements and how to meet them, and also the value of a good budget. There will be around 13 slides, and I will try to make this an interactive session, and we will, as I said, have the Q&A at the end. So proposal development is not among the easiest tasks of business development, but it does come with its additional challenge of putting together budgets. And some of the challenges of budget development is can be summarized as the content of the proposal may not be ready in time to develop the detailed budget. And there might be problems with the clarity of the unit costs or the regular costs of the organization. Within the team, there might be delays in responding to the required information, and there might be problems with meeting the internal deadlines. And there might be a question about the donor templates, because sometimes we might find the donor templates quite complicated. And according to our experience working with NGOs and working in business development for more than 15 years, we could easily say that 30% of proposals fail because of their budgets. And this is sometimes due to budgets not making sense. So could we make use of the chat box for a few minutes? And if you could suggest why this statement is correct and what can be wrong with the budgets that would lead to losing a proposal? I just received, I just saw the message that some of the participants cannot see the slides. Let me just share them again. So I hope they are visible now. Great. Yes, so. Well, we do have a lot of input in the chat box, some of which join on the justification of budgets, lack of clarity, final calculations can sometimes be wrong, unrealistic budget lines, unrealistic numbers, employee salaries that might be over the given benchmark. Yeah, the donor's instructions on specific percentages. And when you find unrealistic numbers or when you go over the budget. Undefined or ambiguous units, yes, that also is part of failed budgets. Bad collaboration between the people involved in the content and finance staff, that is one of the internal tricks of preparing strong budgets. Overhead costs, operating and running costs that are always a bit tricky in how to present them in the budgets. Yeah, if they do not match the proposed activities, that is definitely a problem. And if we have, if the budget looks like it's being bloated and it does not really speak for the intended results. Yeah. Thank you everyone. And content of the proposal is not concrete enough for making a good budget. So yeah, the story needs to be very much aligned between the proposal and the financial part. So here are a couple of our findings on why budgets can sink the submitted proposals if the calculations are incorrect and if the budget exceeds the stated amount in the terms of reference, and the budget does not include all the details and explanations the donor asked for, so meeting the donor's expectations. The donor template is not used, and then one of the reasons might be a lack of transparency on how unit costs have been calculated. So then the donor would like to see how you reached those figures. If there are large consistency costs without explanations, if the indirect costs are too high or over the percentage allocated for those costs, if the human resource costs are not reflected transparently, if they lack the justification of why and what they represent, and if the size of the budget is either too large or too small compared to the terms of reference. So quickly going back to the chat box, could I have a few suggestions on whether any of these reasons can actually be avoided when preparing the budget? Within the organization, within your NGO, as your responsibilities for putting together a proposal, can these be avoided? Yes, they can all be avoided. Through planning and better understanding, careful, time management. Teamwork between the different departments, finance and program staff. Vigilant attitude and ample planning. They are wonderful keywords. Thank you, Komar. Time management is also crucial, especially, yes, when we are under pressure, and deadlines always bring that pressure on us. Thank you very much. When we are preparing budgets, we should always keep in mind that preparing a budget is equally as important as writing the technical proposal. And therefore, it needs to, be shown the similar scrutiny and attention to detail that we show to writing the technical proposal, the activities and the results. So getting started on the 10 tips. Our first tip on this issue is to treat the budget development as a project in itself. And in line with all the inputs you have shared, it is very important to start the budget preparation from the same timeline as the proposal development. So in order to do that, it would be very helpful to have a meeting with the proposal team and ask questions about amounts, about the restrictions. Have there been any discussions with the donor? Are there any gray areas? It's very important to read the financial requirements of the donor and make sure that you have the correct templates, a good understanding of the format as well as the content that is being expected by the donor. The project plan with a timeline can be developed in this initial meeting, including the drafting of the budget and the internal deadlines respectively. And we need to ensure that our timeline is in line with the rest of the requirements of the bid. So, you know, the drafting of the activities and the outputs and the overall design of the project. And one of the things we should always keep an eye on is to leave adequate time for the approval review and approval processes. Can I see a hands up of from the participants who have problems with the review and approval processes, that they take too long and they are very, very last minute? There is, yeah. There's a hand raising possibility, and I can see 2 people have raised their hands in, yeah, we got 4. Yes, so leaving things to the last minute, especially when it is related to reviews and approvals, that is always risky, because when a document comes back from a review with even minor changes, that affects both the budget preparation and the technical proposal, and everything needs to be reviewed, which in turn translates to time management. And number 2 is with the templates. So if we have a template provided by the donor, we have to make sure that we understand it very, very well, and we use that from day one to prevent any loss of information, any loss of data. And we have to structure the budget based on the donor requirements, not our general or daily used formats, but on the requirements of the donor. We have to make sure that, you know, the information given on the template is the correct one. And in case there is not a template, we should always use Excel or Google Sheets, but never Word. So we should make the document work for us instead of, you know, doing things manually. Because building in the formulas would help us to minimize any calculation errors. One of the common mistakes that we often face in preparing budgets is identifying the currency correctly. Sometimes there is a lack of clarity in which currency the donor wants to see the project, or the organization does the calculations in their own currency and then forgets to use the updated rate, exchange rate, to show in the final versions. And these, you know, small but important details are very important in the final versions of the budgets. Number 3 in our 10 tips is making sure that the content is clearly reflected in the budget. This is our way of showing that our proposal is telling the same story as our budget. So the content of our proposal, the activities, the expected outcomes, and the results have to be 100% matching the budget. If there are gaps or if there are things that do not match, then this will raise questions in the minds of the donors, and most of the time they will not come to you to ask these questions. They will just break points, or they will just eliminate you from the race. So in order to make sure that our stories are aligned between the narrative and the financial proposals, we have to double check and triple check our contents before submissions. And also the way we prepare the budget is also critical in the end result. Even though there is no right or wrong way of preparing a budget, and most of the time when there's a donor template, it depends on the donor preference. We can stick to either activity budgets or line by line budgets. And in the activity budgets, we can separate the program into a group of smaller activities like work packages, and each work package would show the contents of that activity and your intentions about it, and also how it stands as in terms of value for money. When you are designing your budgets in activity packages or using this activity budget format, then you visualize the program activity by activity. And the negative part of working with activity budgets is sometimes you might forget the things that are non-activity budgets items, or if there are too many activities in the proposal, then it might get a bit complicated. On the other hand, the second version would be the line-by-line budgets, where we place all expenses of the same type within the same line. So all human resources costs go under that category, and travel costs go under, all travel and accommodation costs go under the same category. This helps this type of budget helps the donor to see where the money is going to be spent. So it divides into different categories and helps with the calculation and comparison of where the funding is going to be spent. When we want to build a strong budget for our proposal, then we also have to start with asking ourselves a couple of questions. And these questions need to be asked at the very beginning so we can identify our cost items. One of these questions is, who will do the work? So how many people with what kind of job titles and what kind of background are needed to implement this specific project? Because staff costs will depend on their expertise, and do you already have the people in your organization, or will you be hiring people? These will all affect the human resources costs? How long will the project take? How long will the implementation take? Are you making sure that you are taking the festivals and holidays and any, breaks in the implementation into account when you are calculating the duration or the number of days people are going to work? What supplies and equipment will be required? So sometimes we see a car rental in a project budget, but there is no maintenance or there's no fuel written in the budget as cost. So from the donor's perspective, the donor would think you are going to rent the car from this project, but you are going to put the fuel from your own accounts. They won't come to you and say, I'm sorry, did you forget to add the fuel line? So that, when you are writing for a line, then you need to take into account what else goes in or what else is linked with this expenditure. Where will the activities take place? Are there any logistics considered? Will you need to rent venues? Will you need to make sure people can get from one place to another in order to attend your activities? Will your team members or will your participants need to travel? If there is travel within your activities, then what kind of reimbursements will there be? Will you be covering accommodation? Will you be covering per diems, and to which level? And will there be any supervision or oversight or any monitoring and evaluation required throughout the activities? So answering these questions would give you the backbone, the structure of your initial budget, and would help with starting to calculate what kind of costs you would expect. Have we forgotten any questions that we should ask at the very beginning? Do you think we should be asking more questions? Victoria says we should maybe ask about the marketing. Any other questions you think we should ask? Reaching an audience, so dissemination activities, what kind of dissemination tools will you use, and how much they would cost? Overheads, and if the funder will cover them. So will get into it in the next slides about the direct or indirect expenses. Okay, and we can talk more about it when if you have any questions in the Q&A session. One of the other tips is knowing whether we have direct or indirect expenses. So from day one, it helps a lot to divide the budget items into two categories: direct expenses and indirect expenses. The donor will most probably have a policy, which will hopefully be guided by the terms of reference, and it will give you an idea of what kind of costs are direct costs and what kind of costs will need to be specified as indirect costs. We need to keep in mind that the structural, managerial, and logistic support indirect expenses are essential to the running and completion of the programs and to the financial health of your organization. So it helps a lot to think about all these expenses and put them into the categories and make sure that everything is included, because if something is left out, then someone from your organization will have to pay for it from a completely different budget. And when you are calculating the direct and indirect expenses, please do not use best guess expense items, because guesswork usually leads to financial challenges during the implementation of projects. So going back to very, very clearly understanding what the donor wants. So I think it's Lindsay's comment, finding out whether overheads will be covered by the donor. So one of the questions we need to clarify very, very quickly in the process is whether the donor policy is covering these overhead costs or indirect costs. If the donor is very, very strict on not covering overhead costs, maybe you may not want to go through with this proposal, and maybe they might not be the right donor for your organization. So, it's always important to take this into account. And also, some of the other frequently made errors is to blowing the project before even you get the opportunity to start. So the percentages, the upper limits, that we should always keep a very careful eye on them. And another thing we should do is to watch the contingencies. We should always stay clear of having vague lines in any unclarity or any vague budget lines, because the lack of clarity shows ambiguity, and it shows that we have not really done our homework, or we are either trying to hide something from the donor, and it is not a plus point on our side. And if we need to calculate, a contingency amounts, it's better to give a good justification for them. And every item in the budget must be justifiable. Sometimes the budget templates give an additional page for justifications, or otherwise these can be added as budget narratives, additional information to the narrative proposal. The extra pairs of eyes, the double checking, triple checking, I personally find this to be of critical importance, because when you are working on a budget and a proposal for a good amount of time, then you stop seeing things. You cannot see your own mistakes, or the information, the data seems to look begins to look similar to you. Therefore, it's very ideal that at least one person who has not worked on the proposal should give it a thorough read and come back with any feedback or identification of mistakes. There should be a triple checking mechanism to make sure that we meet the donor requirements, the percentages that were given, the durations, and the rules of the donor. And we have to make sure that the numbers on the financial proposal are also the same on the technical proposal. This was something I touched on briefly at the beginning. We should be very, very careful about when we make a change, when we change something in one of the sections, then it should also translate in the other document as well. And our final tip is to emphasize the value of a good budget. So when we are submitting a proposal to a donor, especially if we have not worked with them before, it says a lot about our program, about our organization, and about how we work. It is a tool of communication. And a good budget, a strong budget, shows openness, it shows value for money, it shows our capacity to prepare a solid budget, and it shows that we can comply with the expectations, and also it shows our skill in getting the information right and credible, which is also an indication of our ability to implement with compliance and with good capacity as well. So these were the 10 tips for improving our proposal budgets, and we can move on to the Q&A session now. Jules, can you see any questions in the Q&A?
Hi there. We haven't had, we haven't had any questions in the Q&A, but there was a question in a few questions in the chat. So I'm going to take them from here. Will the financier pay for partial or full cost?
That very much depends on the guidelines and the terms of reference of the donor. Some donors accept paying for the overhead costs. Some donors have strict policies against overhead costs. So this is something that needs to be understood from day one. If possible, if there are working relationships with the donor, then might be room for negotiation. But if the donor is strictly against the overhead costs, then it might be a good idea to look somewhere to cover those costs.
Thank you, Hande. We have another question. What is a good balance between project and operational costs?
That also depends on on a number of things, one of which is the scope of the project and the duration of the project. Some projects require a lot of human resources for a long period of time, and therefore can take up to 30% of the total budget. But in some cases, in software projects, then the scope can fall down to 5, even to 7%.
Okay, great. Thank you. Greetings from Uganda. Just a quick one on expenses. Do you need to do a market survey for costs?
Well, it kind of depends on what you expect from a market survey. So in the countries you operate, you are already familiar with many of the costs and the reasons for those costs. So you are already starting with an advantage on your point. But instead of a market survey, our suggestion would be to do a good research. And normally when you would do a procurement for your organizations, you would get at least 3 quotes to see, to also calculate value for money. And the same should apply when you are putting together a financial proposal.
Thank you. I'm just going to head over to the Q&A section. If you guys do have questions, please ask them in the Q&A section. not in the chat line any longer. So Catherine asked, you mentioned either showing a budget by activity or category. Some organizations use categories and activities in one budget, i.e. generic HR first, T&S, then activity cost. Would you recommend against this?
My recommendation would be towards clarity and also towards the contents of the project. So if you have a project which has numerous activities, then going for activity-based budget might complicate things and might lead you to have overlapping budget items or losing information. So in that case, a line budget might be more useful for you. In terms of practicality, what I used to do, let's say, I always drafted my budgets in accordance with what kind of different categories I would need, like human resources, travel, accommodation, activity costs, and other costs. So I would first get a draft on those and then see how it aligns with the donor's template.
Thank you. Victoria has asked a question. What do you recommend between breaking down budgets into number 1, direct, indirect costs, or number 2, cost categories, or when does it make more sense to use which?
With regards to direct and indirect costs, it's always helpful to keep the indirect costs to the end, because you need to show to the donor that the amount of money you are requesting from them is for the implementation of the activities that you have purposefully built in your technical proposal. So that is the justification of your proposal, and that should be the backbone of your financial budget as well.
Great, thanks, Hande. And we have an anonymous question. We often find that we're working between the tensions of recovering our full overhead costs and presenting a competitive budget. Our HQ is often pushing for lots of staff costs to be added to the budget, but we know that we might put off some donors. Do you have any advice?
It does put off some donors, and lately more and more donors are more interested in financing the activities rather than the human resources or operational costs of organizations. So one of our recommendations for that is to have a diverse source of income, to have as many long-term donors, funding organizations as possible, so that you can divide those operational costs and overheads between them, and it would not be like a large lump sum expectation from just 1 or 2 donors.
Great, thank you. Isabel has asked, what is a good balance between project and operational costs? 70-30?
That is a very tricky question, Isabel. It depends very much on the donor. For example, from the top of my head, I can give the GIZ example. In one of the GIZ projects, they were okay with 70-30. But in some technical projects, they did not want overheads or operational costs to exceed 10%. So again, quite dependent on the donor, the scope, and the type of activity.
Great, thanks, Hande. Gertrude has asked, what is the average acceptable percentage for overhead costs?
I think we just replied it in
a different way.
Yeah.
As I read it, I thought so. Sorry about that. So next question from Jude. How can you best build in inflationary assumptions into costs given the current context?
Well, I come from Turkey, so inflation is, you know, our one of the things we are very familiar with. And what can happen in similar circumstances, similar economies, is first of all, provide information about this in your narrative proposal and also in your budget narrative. Lay the background when you are before you are submitting the proposal, and when your project is approved, ask the donor for a review of costs and review of activities, because it does happen quite a lot that the costs might have considerably changed from the submission of the proposal to the award of a proposal. And when given the proper justification and the explanation from the proposal stage, then many of the donors are have an understanding approach on these matters.
Great, thanks, Hande. Next question. The challenge we have is that personnel are always employed on contract, so we have to jump through more hoops to do a selection. In this day and age, this view seems a bit outdated. Do you have any views on this?
Well, similarly to one of the previous questions, having a variety of donors usually helps with this challenge, because when you have a pool of different donors who you are regularly working with, then you also have a better understanding of the duration, the length of the funding you have secured, which in turn gives security to the people you are working with.
Thank you. And then just the second part of the same question, we also have differences when travel has in some cases been moved to the consultant rather than in travel. And that is from the same end donor, different projects. Is there a way of arguing that this is being illogical?
If it is the same donor, but with different rules for different projects, then this can be open to discussion with your counterpart on the donor side. And you can ask for justifications, or you can ask for some kind of flexibility, especially if it's the same donor.
Great, thank you. Just a quick question. Do you have any specific tips about USAID or UE?
For USAID, I can, one of my tips would be to start as early as possible, because their templates are very detailed and somewhat complicated. So it's like they speak a different language when it comes to the proposal templates and the budget templates. So start well ahead. And for the EU, different EU programs use different templates, but at the end of the day, they merge on line budgets, and also giving very, very clear justifications of your costs, good explanations, bring more points.
Great, thank you. We have just a couple of minutes left. I know there are lots of questions here. If we do not answer your question, please do email us and we will do our best to get back to you. So let me just do one or two more. Hande, are you all right with that?
Yeah.
All right, so Simon's question, given that funders are always reluctant to cover full indirect admin costs, what are some creative ways to part of these in the activity budgets?
First of all, when you are putting together a budget for a project, please make sure that whatever you put in that template reflects the reality. Because when you when a donor is evaluating your proposal and budget, they are comparing and contrasting with other candidates as well. So any differences in similar budget lines will be realized, and they will not be very pleasant to see if they have been if the figures have been inflated.
Great, thank you. And I think this is be our last question. What do you think the easiest way managing different donors, projects, and budget period all at once without being dependent on one person from it all?
Without being dependent on one person?
Yeah. So what is the easiest way of managing different donors, projects, and budget period all at once without relying on one person?
Using budget management tools, not the expensive software, but to have your own methodology for keeping track of the different stages of proposal development. So, and always being in the know about the about what is going to happen, or what when the milestones are, and comparing them in line with the proposal you have promised to deliver.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hande.